The other day, a video popped up on my timeline that was very interesting to me. It was put out by a Christian. I believe his name is Bill Wortman here. It's iPUB is the name of his podcast here. I think it's Institute for the Public Understanding of the Bible, something along those lines. He's got a nice little podcast going on over there, and this just popped up in my YouTube videos. I hadn't heard of the gentleman before or his podcast, but he was responding to Bart Ehrman and a couple of Bart Ehrman's criticisms of the Bible, where Bart thinks people misunderstand the Bible, and there's almost like a miscommunication, like the two are talking past each other. I wanted to address that because I had some thoughts on the matter. I'm Steve Perry. This is Biblical Anarchy, and today we're taking a look at Bill Wortman's video. And here on this first video, you can see Bart Ehrman's face because he kind of froze it on the screen, but you're going to hear Bill Wortman speaking about something that is said in the book of Acts about John and Peter.
The more curious question that I would have for those who are skeptics is, why are you trusting the book of Acts on this? I mean, he just cited the book of Acts. Well, why would you trust the book of Acts? Are you skeptical about this, or are you just trusting Ehrman's judgment that on this particular fact, it must be historical? But are you trusting it because it fits your narrative you want to believe? Or are you sure Ehrman isn't drawn to it simply because it fits sort of the way he wants to see things? Or does he have a good, historically demonstrable argument for why this particular comment about the disciples is in fact historically reliable? Because frequently scholars just kick things to the curb all the time, and so is this reliable or not? How would you know that? I can easily think of a reason why the author might have exaggerated their unlearnedness, that the fact that they weren't schooled, because it simply creates more of a David and Goliath type thing where only God could be doing what is happening. So I mean, it's easy to come up with a reason to be a little bit doubtful about the writer's motives in painting the disciples as unlearned. So does that mean now you're just going to be skeptical about this and reject it, and therefore reject his comment about the fact that the disciples would not have been able to produce any kind of writing? So anyway, again, I'm just trying to push against you if you're a skeptic. Are you sure you're being even-handed in judging these things as you hear them? Why are you sometimes okay with someone citing from something from the Bible and it's so suddenly reliable, and other times it's unreliable? How are you deciding these things, and how did Ehrman decide these things?
Yeah, now I think that's a very valid question. Are we being even-handed? I am a skeptic of the New Testament without a doubt. Am I being even-handed? And I think in my case, I obviously think the answer is yes, although I could be wrong. But I think what's more interesting here is how the different ways in which we view the Bible. We can view it as a historical book. If we look at a translation like the King James Version, we can look at it as a work of art. We can look at it as a divinely inspired word from God. There are many different ways we can look at it. And I think that what's happening here is there's a hang-up between two different ways of looking at the Bible. What he's discussing is in Acts chapter 4, where Peter and John are called illiterate, basically. But the interesting thing here is he seems to be in a position where he cannot come out and say something I can come out and say. If you read this in its context, it's not that the author of Acts is calling Peter and John illiterate. Follow me here. If you go to verse 5, it says, "On the next day their rulers and elders and scribes gathered together in Jerusalem with Annas the high priest, and Caiaphas, and John and Alexander, and all who were of the high priest family. And when they had set them in their midst, they inquired, 'By what power or by what name did you do this?'" So they're asking Peter and John questions here. Who? The council, the Sanhedrin, the high priest, the leaders in Jerusalem are asking the question. Then if we go down to verse 13, we see, "Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated common men, they were astonished, and they recognized that they had been with Jesus." So it is the perception of the Sanhedrin that Peter and John are illiterate. The word they're uneducated. He gets into a discussion in the video, I'll link it down below, as to how far one would take that, but it could literally mean that they're illiterate. The problem here is that if you come at this from the Bible is breathed out by God, every word literally true, then I guess you would have to come to the conclusion that they're illiterate, at the very least uneducated. I don't see it that way myself. Like, the author is saying that the Sanhedrin perceived them to be illiterate, but he doesn't say why this perception. Could it be simply that they're fishermen from Galilee? They said, there's no way these guys are educated. I don't read too much into that statement. But even more interesting is, if we go to the book of John itself, I don't see where it's relevant as to whether or not John wrote the book of John, which I personally don't have much of an opinion on the matter. But if we go down to the end, what's interesting to me is the last chapter in the book of John is chapter 21. But if we go to the end of chapter 20, verse 30, we read, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." Now, if we go to the next chapter, which is the last chapter, the final verse in that chapter, "Now there are also many other things that Jesus did, were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." They both sound like an ending. To me, and this is just my opinion, I haven't researched this with scholars or anything, I'm of the opinion that the last chapter of John is written by somebody other than the author of the rest of the book of John. So one could easily conclude that it is indeed John who is the author of the book of John. But if you start in verse 20 of chapter 21, it says, "Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who also had leaned back against him during the supper and said, 'Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?' When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, 'Lord, what about this man?' Jesus said to him, 'If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me.' So the saying spread among the brothers that this disciple is not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you?" Now, it sounds here like they're saying that this disciple whom Jesus loved has passed away. And so there's people are saying, well, Jesus said he was going to remain until he came back. And they're saying, no, that's not actually what Jesus said. Then he goes on to say, "This is a disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things. And we know that his testimony is true." Who's we? Like, if this is being written by one disciple, by John, the entire thing, including the last chapter, it doesn't make sense for it to say, "We know that his testimony is true," because this would be the author himself writing, right? So it seems to me, just logic, okay? I haven't studied this. I'm not sure why one would conclude that the disciple that Jesus loves is John. John seems to be a marginal disciple in most of the stories. If you just ask me, just from reading the Gospels, like, who is the disciple that Jesus loved, I would guess Peter. Again, I don't know. I haven't, because I really don't care if John wrote it or not. To me, it seems like this last chapter is being authored by some followers of this disciple after his death, and that they are attesting that that disciple wrote what came before it, right? Did he or did he not is a whole nother question, but it does seem to me that the book of John is claiming to be authored by a disciple, and that it is that disciple's followers who are authenticating that writing. That's just the way it seems to me. And so I agree with Bill here, excuse me, that Bart Ehrman is being a little unfair in the way he approaches this, because he's kind of using the momentum of the religious reading against the religious reader, saying that if you accept Acts as breathed out by God, then it has to be true that they're illiterate, and therefore John couldn't have written this. Acts doesn't seem to be saying that, and John doesn't, whether or not it's John, whoever the author may be, whomever that disciple may be, it seems to be that this is authored by a disciple, and that at some point after his death, we get the last chapter added on. That's just my interpretation. Could be wrong. I'm just offering it up for your consideration. Now, where this gets more interesting to me, because I did a video earlier, I'll link it down below. And this is going to wind up being a part 2 to that video. That part 2 should have come out a long time ago. He gets into the alleged disagreements between James and Paul. Here's what he has to say on the matter.
There was an orthodox line of teachers and teachings that came out of the apostles. I think that's the simplest conclusion to draw from the fact that there is so much unity in all these early Christian writers. So again, there's confrontation for sure, but it's a reaction to something that's going out about the story of Jesus and the significance of Jesus. Now, if he means by the Peter and Paul disagreement there in Galatians 2, that even the apostles themselves didn't really have an orthodoxy about the gospel and how to interpret Jesus, I think that's sort of clearly wrong. Just read the argument of Galatians 1 and 2. And what you should conclude, if you can follow an argument, is that the Paul is actually making the opposite point that I think Ehrman was trying to make in referencing it. Paul's argument is that the gospel is not from humans. That's the whole argument of Galatians 1 and 2. You can read it for yourself. Not even apostolic humans are the source of the gospel. It came from God. It's dependent upon the authority of God, not upon any human. And the story of Peter, where he refused to associate with Gentiles, socialize with Gentiles up in Antioch, and then got rebuked by Paul, the reason he's called a hypocrite is precisely because Peter, as Paul has already told us earlier in chapter 2, Peter and James and John and Paul all agreed about what the gospel is. So the fact that Peter acted in a way that was inconsistent with orthodoxy, with the very fundamental truth of the gospel, which none of them believed they got from anyone other than Jesus, then that makes Peter a hypocrite. He's acting in a way that's inconsistent with the orthodoxy that he knows to be true.
Now, to be clear, everything he just said is correct from a religious interpretation. What do I mean by that? Catholics and Protestants have a much different interpretation of this whole thing between James and Paul. Yet, they both agree emphatically that James and Paul did not disagree with each other. So, since Christians are the interpreters from a religious perspective of the New Testament, this is the correct understanding. It's correct because that's what the church decided is the correct understanding. Historically speaking, he is dead wrong. If you're reading the Bible from a historical perspective, Paul and James absolutely do not agree with each other. You cannot argue that they do. You just can't. We're going to start in Galatians 2. And Paul says, "But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, 'If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews?'" Now, there are several problematic things in what is said here that I want to point out. First off, I want to point out that this controversy has nothing to do with circumcision, okay? It has to do with eating at the same table with the Gentiles. So why does he point out that these are members of the party of circumcision? That's number one. Secondly, it says even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy, and it says the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him. So in other words, this isn't just Peter disagreeing with Paul. This is all the Jewish followers of Jesus who are with them at this time, siding with Peter and Barnabas and James, okay? So this is everybody against Paul. This isn't just Paul and Peter. So what is going on here? When we get to the last statement, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? There's nothing in this about what Peter did. It says he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. So he stopped eating with them and went and ate with the Jews. He wasn't forcing the Gentiles to live like a Jew. What is this all about? If we just take this at its surface level, then, he's got a point. This is just a disagreement between a couple of people. But something much deeper is happening here. So let's go back. Notice he says that this happens in Antioch, right? And I want to point out that we can see what happens in Antioch in the book of Acts. And if we go to chapter 15, verse 37, we get an interesting thing here. Now, Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. So what's happening here? Paul and Barnabas are about to set off on another missionary journey. This would be their second one. And Barnabas wants to take John Mark with them. Paul says no, he withdrew from us in Pamphylia. The general Christian interpretation of this is that John Mark is unreliable. However, the Pamphylia thing is interesting. So let's go back up to Acts 14, starting at verse 24. This is Paul and Barnabas' first missionary journey. It says, then they passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. Now, this is where John Mark departs, right? And when they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Italia, and from there they sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled. And when they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles, and they remained no little time with the disciples. So what happens after Pamphylia? They seem to pass through speaking to a couple churches in Perga and Italia, and then they sail to Antioch, which is where this happens between Peter and Paul. So let's read on in chapter 15. But some men came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Wait a second. Now what we read back in Galatians is starting to make sense, right? These are the party of circumcision. Unless you're circumcised according to the custom of Moses. In other words, unless you subject yourself to the law of Moses, you cannot be saved. But it says here, some men came down from Judea. It doesn't tell you that they were sent by James. Now it's starting to look like John Mark had a disagreement with Paul. And that's why he left the group in Pamphylia. It appears to me, this is just my interpretation. It appears that John Mark probably said something to James about what Paul was saying, and so James sent people to correct Paul. I'm going to make this point more solid as I go along. Unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and the elders about this question. So they're sent to Jerusalem. They're going to debate this out. We see here in chapter 15 the debate. Here's the conclusion, starting in verse 19. It says, therefore, my judgment is that we should not trouble those of the Gentiles who turn to God, but should write to them to abstain from the things polluted by idols and from sexual immorality and from what has been strangled and from blood. For from ancient generations, Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. So what they're saying here is that there has been a tradition in the past that those who are Gentiles who want to follow God can, but they have to follow certain laws, but not all the laws of Moses. So the ruling here is that they should abstain from things polluted by idols. So don't eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols. Don't get involved in sexual immorality. Don't eat animals that have been strangled. They have to be killed in a humane way, right? And don't eat the blood. So these are the rules that, according to James, followers of Jesus have to follow. They don't have to get circumcised into the law of Moses. but they do have to follow these basic laws in addition to believing in Jesus. So here's from the letter that they sent out. It's in verse 28. It says, "For it has seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay on you no greater burden than these requirements, that you abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. If you keep yourselves from these, you will do well. Farewell." So notice there is a whole disagreement here. This is not just Peter and Paul disagreeing with each other. James is coming to a conclusion, and if you can go read the letters of Paul for yourself in multiple places, he tells you that there's nothing wrong with eating meat that has been sacrificed to idols, unless in so doing you cause another brother to stumble. Okay? Paul disagrees with the conclusion that James made here, but the question is, do they ever resolve this issue? And the answer is no, they don't. Let's see, I did not mark this passage, so I'm going to have to stumble around. That's okay. It should be Acts 21, I believe. And we go to Acts 21, and yes. So what's happening here? Why am I going to Acts 21? Well, Paul is going to Jerusalem here. And this is at the end of his ministry. So we see this confrontation happened on the first missionary journey. This is early in the ministry. Here we're coming to the end of Paul's ministry. It is this very incident that is going to lead to Paul's arrest, which is going to lead him to be sent to Rome, where he will allegedly, according to church tradition, be executed by Nero. So we go to Acts 21:17. It says, "When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified God, and they said to him, 'You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law.'" So here's Paul coming to Jerusalem. Paul's been out teaching this. You don't have to follow the law, right? But here we are in Jerusalem, and suddenly James is saying, "Hey, look how many Jews we've been having a good little ministry here ourselves, and our people are zealous for the law. And they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs." Ladies and gentlemen, is that true? Does Paul teach them that they don't have to follow the law of Moses? Yes, that is true. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. Does Paul live in observance of the law? No, he does not. But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. So here, James references back to this letter that has been sent before. Then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them, and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering presented for each one of them. So Paul does what James asked him to do. Why would Paul do what James asked him to do? We go to 1 Corinthians 9, starting in verse 19. "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I may win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law." So here he says, I'm not under the law, "that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one." So you see, this is consistent with what Paul is saying. They are under the law. They have subjected themselves to the law. So I became as one under the law so that I might win some of them. Paul does not agree with James here, folks. He absolutely does not agree with James. But I want to hop back to Acts chapter 21. Because what we have James doing here at the end of Paul's ministry is saying, hey, we're in disagreement here. or people at least think we're in disagreement. I want you to prove to people that you agree with me. Paul goes through with it, but James references this letter that was sent out to the Gentiles, right? But as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols and from blood. Is it reasonable to conclude that if James disagrees with Paul, in addition now to the letter that he sent to Gentiles, now that he's of the understanding that Paul has been teaching Jews not to follow the law, is it reasonable to think that James would then write a letter to all the Jews out in the dispersion that Paul might have encountered with this teaching? Go to James 1:1. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. And it is here in his book of James where our disagreement comes full-fledged, where Paul uses the example of Abraham and says that Abraham believed God, was counted him as righteousness before he ever did a work. James says, no. That was fulfilled when he did the work of sacrificing Isaac, right? These two men absolutely disagree on this point. Now, religiously, I'm wrong. I get that. You walk into church on Sunday and ask your pastor, he's going to tell you that I'm wrong. But if you read the book of Acts and you listen to Acts 21 and you believe that what Acts 21 is telling you is the truth, I'm right. I'm not wrong. James and Paul absolutely do not agree. And it's not just James and Paul. John Mark left Paul's ministry. It doesn't clearly tell us why. I get that. But from that time forward, Paul is being confronted everywhere he goes. Just read his letters. He is being confronted by other apostles, that they're called, by other teachers of Christianity, saying Paul's wrong. And he's having these confrontations in all of his churches. And we see there in Galatians 2, where it's not just Paul who disagrees, or Peter who disagrees with Paul. It's also Barnabas and the rest of the Jews who were there with them. So was there an orthodoxy? To answer Bill's question, yeah, it appears there was an orthodoxy. But the orthodoxy was with James and Peter and their followers. Paul is the one going against that orthodoxy and teaching a heretical teaching that you do not have to follow the law of Moses or the laws for the Gentiles in order to follow Jesus, that you're saved by faith alone. James absolutely disagrees with that. It's clear in the book of James, but it's even more crystal clear in Acts chapter 21. If you disagree with me, you can leave a comment down below. If you enjoy the video, give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, subscribe to the channel. Whatever you do, don't just sit there. Do something.